Today is May 3rd, 2024, and it's day 23 of my Great American Motorcycle Adventure. Today's meanderings took me 172 miles. From Pueblo, Colorado, through the southern Rockies, along the Arkansas River, and back again to Pueblo. It was a loop that covered snow-dusted forests, a quirky roadside castle, rugged ridgelines, deep gorges, and wide-open valleys. It was one of those days that makes you feel lucky to ride a motorcycle. It helped that I didn't have anywhere I had to be for the next 44 days. No real schedule, no reservations to keep. The BMW rally in Redmond, Oregon wasn't until June 15th. And sure, I'd be visiting friends and family along the way. If it worked out, great. If not, that was okay too. I wasn't riding to get somewhere anymore. I was just riding. The day also felt like a transition point in the trip. Behind me were places that felt familiar, states and landscapes and roads that I'd lived in and ridden through. But ahead were the Rockies, and from here on out, I'd be riding through places I'd never seen from the saddle before, and probably won't get a chance to ride on this kind of trip again. As I headed out, I chatted with the woman working at the front desk. I told her about my plans, and when I mentioned Skyline Drive, she gave me a look. "You're gonna ride that on a motorcycle?" she asked, clearly a little surprised. I wasn't quite sure what she meant at the time, but I'd come to understand by the end of the day. And it was an amazing day. And I want you to know ahead of time that this is going to be a long video for two reasons. The practical reason is because I just couldn't find places to cut short. I'd look through the footage, and around the next turn was always something I'd think you'd want to see. The other reason is because I want you to feel as immersed in the ride as I did. This channel is all about sharing the beauty I find on the bike with you, in hopes that you might feel inspired to explore in your own way. I like motorcycles, but cars, bicycles, RVs, Jeeps, trikes, or even your own 2 feet would all work just fine. However you like to get out there, just get out there. The first stretch took me south on I-25. As I rode, Greenhorn Mountain kept getting larger, rising in the distance like a signal that I was entering something bigger. The mountain marks the beginning of the Wet Mountains, a sub-range of the Sangre de Cristos, which are part of the Great Rocky Mountain system. This was my first day of riding in the Rockies, and when I reached 9,507 feet at Wixon Divide, it really sank in. That's higher than anything east of the Mississippi, by more than a mile in most cases. The road led me into the San Isabel National Forest, where winding mountain curves opened and closed like accordion folds between the stands of tall trees. The roads were clear, but snow still clung to the shaded edges and lay quietly beneath the pines. The air was cold and clean. Thinner, yes, but refreshing in a way that made me sit up a little straighter in the saddle. The scent, sharp and earthy, was distinctly alpine. You notice the smells when you're riding a motorcycle in the way that you just can't in a car. Compared to the thick forests in the southeast, like the Smokies, this felt entirely different. In the Smokies, you've got basswood, poplar, ash, hemlock, maple, birch, beech, and oak. And here in the Rockies, it's a different palette. Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, quaking aspen, Engelmann spruce. The elevations are higher, the terrain is more rugged, and the whole ecosystem feels more exposed, more vertical. Tucked away in these woods is something truly unexpected, Bishop Castle. Built by one man, Jim Bishop, over the course of decades, this strange and sprawling structure rises out of the trees like something out of a fantasy novel. It's chaotic, quirky, full of welded iron and hand-laid stone towers. It's free to visit. It speaks to a kind of wild, relentless creativity that's hard not to admire. Coming out of the dense forest and approaching Silver Cliff, I got my first panoramic view of the Sangre de Cristos Mountains. Sharp, majestic, stretching across the horizon in stark contrast to everything around them. Moments like that make me feel incredibly fortunate to be able to ride through these landscapes. And they remind me why it matters that we protect them. Thankfully, much of this land is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. They do vital work, and they need our support to keep these places wild and accessible. Now I'll be quiet for about 5 minutes, and let you just soak it in with the lull of the engine. Now I'm heading north, in the valley between the Sangre de Cristos on my left and the wet mountains on my right. Riding here was more about sweeping turns and rolling hills than the tight twisties and the steep sections over the mountain pass, and much warmer in the valley as I made a slow descent back towards the Arkansas River Gorge. At Texas Creek, I turned east onto 50, the same road I was on and crossed Kansas, and I followed the Arkansas River back towards Pueblo. I love riding along rivers. There's a rhythm to it. The road twists, echoing the water's curves. The sound of the current keeps you company, sometimes a gentle murmur, sometimes a full rush. And there's something soothing about it all. Along the way, I even passed some rafters, putting in and pulling out at various spots, getting ready for their own adventures. It reminded me that these outdoors have a way of welcoming everyone. Whether you're on a motorcycle or in a raft, we all get to appreciate these places in a different, but equally meaningful way. Here again, I'm going to be quiet for about the next 5 minutes, so you can just enjoy the ride. I rode past Royal Gorge, where the Arkansas has cut out a canyon over 1,200 feet deep. The Royal Gorge Bridge, built back in 1929, was once the highest suspension bridge in the world. It's a feat of engineering and nerve. As I neared Cañon City, I took the left turn onto Skyline Drive. This one-way road follows a narrow ridgeline high above the valley below, with sheer drop-offs and no guardrails. It was built by prison labor in 1905, and it's an adrenaline-pumping, jaw-dropping ride. But not a fast ride. Now I know why the hotel clerk was surprised earlier. I'm glad I didn't know. I'm not so great with the high cliff edges, and this is not for the faint of heart. I've actually got a separate video of that ride, if you want to see the full hair-raising experience. I'll link to it in the description. After surviving Skyline, I headed to Liberty Point, which offers a sweeping view of the Pueblo Reservoir. Birds soared on thermals above the water, and I met a friendly local who shared a bunch of recommendations, some of which I'd end up taking a few days later on my ride from Colorado Springs to Denver. I always appreciate the people who take their time to offer a little local insight. It adds so much to the journey. When I rolled back into the hotel that afternoon, the parking lot was full of Porsches. A whole group of them had driven up from Texas just to drive the Pikes Peak Highway. Talking to them the next morning, they told me the road had only been open to 11,000 feet, but they were hoping it would be open all the way to the summit by the time they got there. I cleaned up and walked over to the Riverwalk for dinner at Angelo's Pizza. I grabbed a seat at the bar and ended up chatting with a few young car enthusiasts. We talked about their dream cars. They were all about the gadgets and going fast. The contrast struck me. I share their love of gadgets, but I'm an older guy, and I just dream about going far. As we talked, it reminded me of the quote from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The test of the machine is the satisfaction it gives you. There isn't any other test. And today, the machine and the moment were so satisfying. I'll drop a link to today's full route in the description if you want to explore it for yourself. Tomorrow, I'll be heading to Colorado Springs to get new tires, ride through the Garden of the Gods, and make my reservation for the Cog Railway up Pikes Peak. Thanks for watching. Until the next ride, be safe, be curious, and keep meandering.